Welcome to another episode of A Come Together. We are back with another episode of Come Together. I am really pushing myself today to get this done because it's been a long couple of days, and quite frankly, I want to do nothing less than record this podcast right now. But this is what it's called, discipline. So it's been an interesting couple of days, and a lot to talk about, a lot to think about, a lot that's been on my mind as always. And I've been experiencing, especially because I've had so many guests over recently, and because I've been hosting so much. One of the things that I've noticed or I've been experiencing is that I don't really get an opportunity on a regular basis to clear my head and to, I accumulate thoughts and things happen and I respond and I consume information and I listen to podcasts and I talk to people and I go about my day and I do things. And then if I don't have the time to sit there and process it, then it kind of boils up in me until it comes to a head at some point. Not necessarily in a negative way, but until I have to get it out. And whether that be in the form of writing, whether it be in the form of podcasting, whether it be in the form of talking to my wife, talking to my parents, talking to my friends, talking to my siblings. It's a process, and like all processes, it could be handled in a relatively healthy way or a relatively unhealthy way. And yeah, I had a very pleasant but relatively strange experience for my own self recently this weekend. And one of my very close friends' mother-in-law came over and let me know that she's actually a big fan of the podcast and she listens very frequently, a bunch of my episodes. And on one hand, it was really, really wonderful to hear because it's validation and everyone loves validation. There's plenty of arguments to be made that validate that the need for validation and the desire for it is really what drives most of our behavior, most of our thoughts, most of our relationships. But and I can't pretend that I'm beyond that completely, but I'm definitely conscious of it, and I try not to have the end all be just validation. Um, and it was funny because I think, I've been in this situation from the other way, from the fan perspective, from the person that is an avid listener or an avid reader or an avid consumer of content. And, you listen and you just retain so much and you hear different conversations. Let's say hypothetically, just to keep comparing apples to apples, the equivalent of if I'd met any of the guys that I listen to on a regular basis, Matt Bellany, Rogan, Huberman, whoever it is, and I talk to them, I'm not sure that I would know how to talk to them like a normal person, in the sense that most of my understanding of who they are is based on what I've heard them talk about for a couple hours, and at most a couple hours, a couple of times a week, right? Um, let's say if I was, and I'm not, there have definitely been times where, weeks or, weeks at a time where this happened. But let's say hypothetically, I'm such an avid Rogan fan. He just gets banger after banger guest and killer after killer guest. And I end up spending 10 hours in the week listening to his podcast, or 15 hours in the week listening to his podcast, right? 5 times a week, or 4 or 5 times a week, 2, 3 hours. Great. You know, that is my image of him in my mind and my association with him. But from his perspective, if I were ever to meet him, then he'd be like, dude, like, I mean, you only know me like 2 hours a day of what I am and what I do and what I think and what I feel and how I respond. And a lot of times, I mean, especially, and I guess I could say this now as someone that records through a podcast 3 or 4 times a week. I don't even remember a lot of things I talk about at a certain point. At a certain point, I don't want to say, I know that I repeat myself. I try to keep things fresh. I try to be intentional about it. Or even if I'm going to repeat something, I want to try to repeat it in a fresh way or, a unique way. But, I don't even know what I'm talking about all the time. And so, or what I've said. And, so I can't even remember most of my podcasts. I can't even remember most of the conversations that I've had, especially these long solo ones where I just talk with myself. I mean, I might remind myself if I start to listen back, or, I'll be like, if someone reminds me, I'll be like, oh yeah, I got that. That makes sense. Right, right. I knew that. But it doesn't jump to the front of my mind, and I think part of the reason why is the same reason why we don't remember anything, which is that when something becomes routine, our brains stop really paying attention to it. And that's actually, I've talked about this before in different contexts. I've talked about it in the context of teaching or performing, but I think it also applies to our own selves. If we're just talking and we keep up the way that we're talking and the pace that we're talking, and it just kind of keeps going, then it's very difficult for anything in particular to stand out in terms of our memory or my memory um, as to what I actually said. So it's kind of a weird experience because at this point, I have dozens of hours of podcasts of myself talking online, and I don't remember majority of what I say. I remember certain things I say. I remember that I know certain things. I know that I think certain things, but I don't remember what I say, who I say to, when I say it, in what context, all the time. And it's actually so funny because the best way that I was able to kind of put this into an example or a metaphor is with the TV show Severance. So right now there's a show Severance on television on Apple TV. Odds are that if you're listening, you probably watched it because it's charting on Nielsen's, I forgot what it's called, chart or list, but Nielsen's is basically what shows or what shows or movies or content get the most time viewed, have the most time spent viewed. So, for example, Nielsen's chart would be tracking which platform or which app gets what percentage of the market share of consumption. So YouTube, like, obviously gets probably it gets by far the most, like far, far, far the most. Netflix is second, but super, super far behind. And then after that, the rest of the streaming services kind of all line up after Netflix. And Apple TV actually has like the smallest portion. When they do occasionally have a breakout, like Ted Lasso or like Severance, then they will, then they'll chart. Then the particular show will chart a little higher. But overall, even if that one show does really well, it's really difficult for Apple TV to kind of break the charts. And Matt Bellany talks a lot about this in The Town, the different strategies or business strategies or content strategies that Apple might have or that other streaming services might have. And Apple and Amazon Prime seem to be both kind of going for the same type of business plan, which is to kind of have some of your own content. They're both gonna be a little picky about what their content is gonna be, but and they're not flushing out tons and tons and tons of content like Netflix or Hulu or obviously YouTube, but that's different because that's user uploaded. But what Apple and Amazon do instead is they revolve their business structure around they're around rentals, purchasing, and kind of being a one-stop shop for all the apps that that you could consume. So, for example, on Amazon, you could get a HBO subscription, you could get a Paramount subscription, I believe at a reduced cost, I believe at a reduced rate. But what they kind of hope for is that once that the whole idea of switching from app to app to find content is really frustrating, and that's something actually that I sympathize with. I hate having to, like, I hate seeing that, I don't know, a movie like Wolf on Wall Street or Scarface or something is on Netflix one day, and the next day I go back and I can't find it, and I go to Hulu and I check Hulu and no, it's not there, and maybe it's on Paramount and maybe it's on Peacock, and I don't know. I can't find it. Oh, it's not on any streaming service for another month. You have to rent it, and then in a month from now, if I want to watch it, it'll be free again on another service. And that's a really, really unpleasant experience. And I think that Amazon and Apple kind of figured that out, and so a lot of their library, or a lot of their viewership comes from those that are willing to bundle all under one app, and they're able to say, okay, well, we automatically get Amazon Prime because everyone in the world is Amazon Prime now. So, okay, we have Amazon Prime, we have the ability to watch all this content for free, and now instead of paying the $8-9 a month for Paramount Plus, I could pay $6 a month, and I could watch all the Paramount Plus content and the Amazon content in one channel. And then, oh, I see that I kind of want to have Hulu or HBO on here as well. And so let me just add that on. Okay, HBO is usually $15 a month. Over here, it's 12 or 9 or whatever it is, depending obviously on whether you have ad tier or what kind of plan you subscribe to, and before you know it, you're spending most of your watching time on one app. But and the reason why Amazon benefits from that is that the more time that you spend watching on Amazon's app, the more advertising money that they get. And the more that they could go to advertisers and say, hey, you're going to pay me X, Y, and Z more because I have X, Y, and Z more viewers this time around, or this month, or this year, or this quarter than we had last time relative to other companies. You're paying X amount of advertising money to Peacock. Well, guess what? We have double the amount of viewers and double the amount of time spent, or triple the amount of time spent watching. So our service, our product, our streaming service is worth more. Um, I digress, because that was all just that was all the cuff, just lesson, I guess, into the way the business plan of these streaming services. But to go back to Severance, so Apple has this TV show called Severance, and the premise, very simply put, is there's a corporation that very clearly is pretty evil, and they and in order to work for them, you have to go through a surgery that severs your consciousness into two, right? You have your work self and you have your home self. And it's actually, I guess when I initially heard of that, my initial reaction was to think about the whole idea and notion that's been very popular in the last couple of years of quote unquote work-life balance, and how people complain, oh, since COVID, there's been, and people work from home, there's no work-life balance. And I guess, I thought the premise of the show was, what if someone, like, this is the ultimate work-life balance, where you don't remember any work during your life, and during life, you don't remember any work. But the show, to their credit, the show is so incredible for so many reasons. The directing, the cinematography, the characters, the acting. It's just, it's legitimately a beautiful and breathtaking show. But I am I'm completely captured by the television every single time I watch it. There's only a couple of shows out that are like that right now. White Lotus is one of those for me, and Severance is just unbelievable. And more than unbelievable, and more than just visually pleasing, or more than just the score, or more than just the slow burn of the tension, or whatever, the acting, it's a very well thought out show. You can tell it's the kind of show where a bunch of people, or a couple of people, or a bunch of people sat in a room and said, what if this was really the case? What if this was real life? What would be real life implications? What would be happening if this was actually occurring? And to really, really think it through in a very realistic sense. And one of the notions that they came up with, and I'm not ruining anything, so don't worry. One of the notions they came up with is the idea that if you have no memory of outside of work when you go into work, then you're essentially starting your life from scratch. Your life is essentially starting from when you first start your job. But that means that you have a whole new identity, right? Because you don't remember your family, you don't remember your experiences, you don't remember your friends. The only thing that you don't even remember your name. The only thing you remember is kind of like the motor skills and the conversational skills. Excuse me, the conversational skills, and that's it. And so they have notion. So they actually started delving into a notion that everyone that's severed has two identities. They call them innies and outies. Innies are the people are the versions of yourself when you're in work, and outies are the version of yourself when you're out of work. And they don't necessarily have to be the same, because what dictates who we are, right? What dictates our behavior? What dictates our thoughts? A lot of times it's an enormous percentage of it is our social interactions, right? Imagine if you have the nature versus nurture, and you're taking a lot of the nurture out of the equation. You take away the social expectations of behaving a certain way or doing things a certain way, and it's just gone, and what's left of you when you don't have that? What's left of me when I'm not trying to impress the people around me? What's left of me when I don't even know what money is? I just know my existence is to do something. I don't get a paycheck. I don't spend my money on anything. The only reason why these quote unquote innies exist is just to exist, like themselves. And it's a really, really, really spectacular idea, and it's really, really cool. But what I was thinking about was, I kind of think that this is what, and I had this realization a couple of times in my life. This is kind of what celebrities, I imagine, go through, right? And to take, obviously, an example that I've mentioned before. Actually, I'll give a different one to keep it just a little fresh. I used to be a huge Billy Joel fan. I loved Billy Joel's music. I used to go. I've probably gone to a dozen of his concerts in the Garden. I know, enormous chunk of the music that he's put out, of the records and the B sides. And I remember actually, when I was in college, my dad gave me a car while I was upstate in Binghamton, and the car didn't have an auxiliary cord, and it didn't have Bluetooth. So I was essentially stuck with either listening to the radio or some DVDs. And I'm looking around the house, 19, 20 years old. I'm going off to college. I'm 19 years old. I'm going off to college. I'm taking this car up, and I found in the house Billy Joel's greatest hits, part one, part two, part three, and part four. I didn't even know that anyone has part three and part four greatest hits, but it's almost needless to say, I did not I didn't know any of the songs, or almost any of the songs in part three or four. I knew a majority of the songs on Billy Joel's greatest hits parts one and two, but imagine now I go to, and I have this association of Billy Joel as this romantic songwriter. And this guy is a beautiful piano player, an amazing storyteller. And and then I go and I hear him as a performer. And as a performer, and I've had this experience many times, when you go hear people perform live, they tell jokes, they tell stories. You feel like you get to know them. You feel like there's more life to the music than just the music itself. And if the performer is really good, then there's a lot more to everything. Then the life of the performer actually enhances the music. And I could definitely say that Billy Joel is one of those performers. And I imagine that if I met him, I mean, I could say to him, Billy Joel, oh my God, I love Falling of the Rain and Summer Highland Falls and You're My Home and all these B-side songs, Keeping the Faith, and and I just can't imagine what you must have been like when you were writing those songs and what your headspace must have been, and you inspired me so much. And Billy Joel's just a regular dude that's like, living his everyday life, divorced a bunch of times, dealing with alimony and childcare, and living on Long Island, and he's taking helicopters to Madison Square Garden once a month, and like his everyday life, he doesn't think about the frame of mind that he was in 40 years ago or 50 years ago when he was writing this music. I mean, he's like, dude, that's not who I am. And like, you might be a huge fan of my songs, but you don't know me. You don't know anything about me. And I guess you could say, and another step further, again, just to kind of, drive the point a little bit more home, you listen to a guy, for myself, if I listen to Rogan, if I listen to Dave Smith, if I listen to Glenn Greenwald, if I listen to whoever, and I go meet them, and I go, oh man, I just, and I have all this information that they've put out over the course of a year or 2 years or 6 months, and I am I'm privy to a percentage of their time in being, but in my head I associate that with being the whole thing. It almost kind of feels to me like when I'm interacting with them, I'm talking to an innie and they're the outie, and so I'm trying to keep on trying to refer, and again, in the Severance language, I'm referring to like a separate part of them that kind of exists in its own little world, in its own little dimension, that's there forever in this podcast world or this music world. But they're outies. They're them living and breathing in real life, and their life doesn't start and stop at the beginning and the end of a podcast. And so they'll look at me like, dude, what? Like, why don't you just talk to me like I'm a regular person? And I can imagine I can imagine that that's probably one of the enormous problems with fame. I can't even imagine. There's a famous story with that I read about with Tony Soprano's character, James Gandolfini, the actor. James Gandolfini's character, Tony Soprano, which I can't believe I just did that after that whole conversation. But James Gandolfini is the guy that acts as Tony Soprano. And obviously, that was one of the most influential and greatest performances in cinematic history. He changed the world. He changed culture. I mean, The Sopranos changed a lot. And James Gandolfini was Tony Soprano. And there's a story that James, and he had a very hard time because when he wasn't recording, when he wasn't acting, and he was just trying to live his life, everyone would come up to him, treating him like Tony Soprano. It's like, dude, I'm not Tony Soprano. Jeremy Piven talks about actually the same thing, his same experience when when he plays Ari Gold, and everyone thinks, oh, hey, he's Ari Gold, he's Ari Gold, he's Ari Gold. He's like, dude, I'm Jeremy Piven. I'm a Jewish guy from Chicago that likes stand-up comedy and acting, and I had a million different jobs before I had a big break, and you don't know anything about me, and I don't know anything about him, and I can't pretend to. But Tony Soprano, James Gandolfini, went to visit a kid one time, a huge fan of his, who was Make a Wish, or maybe he, someone, a fan reached out and said that their kid was really sick or that they were really sick. I don't remember the exact details. It's not really important. But he goes to a hospital to visit this kid that's on his deathbed, and he writes him a letter, and he says, keep being strong. We're so proud of you. So impressed. Love James. Love Jim. I think he went by Jim. And he gave the note to the kid's mom, to give to the kid before he left. And the mom read the note, and then looked at him and said, you think you could sign it from the other guy? And he was like, yeah, sure. And he crossed out Jim, he crossed out Jim and wrote Tony Soprano on the letter, and on one hand, it's beautiful for the kid because it's making a kid, it's really, as far as that kid's concerned for his reality and for his life, it's Tony Soprano writing him a letter. I mean, that's incredible. But from Gandolfini's perspective, no one wants to hear from James Gandolfini, and I mean, unfortunately, and it breaks my heart to say this, but I can't imagine that it's such a surprise that he struggled with issues like alcohol abuse and drug abuse and food, and he abused food like crazy, and he was overweight, and you know and I don't blame him because his existence to everyone, and I don't even think himself, because I don't know that he necessarily, or when you're in that situation, that you necessarily confuse yourself with that person. I've heard people claim that. I don't know, but I've heard people make the say that, I mean, can you imagine living your life where everywhere you go in the street, and everyone that sees you, you go to the supermarket, you go to a restaurant, you go to your kid's birthday party, and everyone's calling you Tony instead of Jim? I mean, it's crazy, and no one wants to hear from you. No one wants to hear what you think. Everyone wants to see Tony Soprano, the mafia boss. So everyone wants to see Tony Soprano eating gabagool and and hitting the strip club and killing Christopher and blah 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 blah. I hope I didn't ruin that for anyone. But if you haven't seen it by now, it came out in 2000. It's 2025, so do your homework. I don't feel that bad. But yeah, I mean, I was just so I was really thinking about that, because I feel like the more that I think that this kind of things happen, the severance idea kind of happens in phases. And one of them initially, the first phase obviously is with fame, because everyone thinks you're someone, but then when they get to talk to you, they realize you're not. And then there's the podcast world where it really is you, it's just a portion of you. And then we kind of in a really weird place, or a really weird world, where we all have our online presence and footprints, and then we have our embodied and in-person footprints. I actually just tweeted about this morning. I just tweeted this morning, but like, it feels like Severance is getting us ready for the fact that, like, we have a digital footprint left behind, and it's certainly a part of us, but it is even more certainly not the whole part of us, or even necessarily an accurate part of us, right? Um, a tweet in a fleeting moment of emotion, or a particular emotional place that only strikes once in a lifetime, or once in a decade, or once in a century, or once in a relationship, doesn't mean that's who you are all the time. But people will say that, and people will think that, and people will come after other people for having written something online. And I feel like, and I really hope that one of the consequences, I mean, it's so hard to be hopeful in a world that is increasingly, it feels like is increasingly choosing to be blind and unwilling to keep an open mind and be understanding. But we also live in a time where we're so advanced, and we are so aware of the value of these of being open-minded and forgiveness and understanding that, a Facebook post when you're 14 in your first or second year of high school obviously does not necessarily reflect what your opinion is a year later, let alone 10 years later, let alone 20 or 30 years later. And I kind of hope that we kind of get to that place where we can really just forgive one another and understand that, our web presence is essentially an innie form of us, but the Audi of us is the living, dynamic, interacting with the world constantly changing, constantly refining, constantly reassessing and reevaluating. And that, to me, is really important. And it's actually funny because that's, I think, my biggest complaint with this, with this book again that I'm reading right now, which is called The Strange Scenes at Laurel Canyon. And it's funny because I guess, technology has exploded so quickly and so rapidly, and the means of communication and information have exploded in such a dramatic way in the last 20 years. But I mean, if you go back 50 years or 70 years or 80 years, it's way more, and and I hear this talked about a lot, but you know, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and probably even the 90s, really, there weren't so many places to get your news or information from. And yeah, if you wanted to be a reporter, you want to be a journalist, and you want to file a freedom of information request, or go to some kind of obscure oh man, what's the word for it? Not the library, but um, the place where everyone keeps records of places. I forgot what it's called. It's going to come to me in a couple of minutes, but that's okay. You have to go and you have to do an insane amount of homework, and you have to travel, and there's only certain places where they don't let you copy any records or documentation, and you have to go and you have to read it yourself, and you could maybe take a picture or write a quote. And then, like, people didn't have access to information the way they do today. And so it was really, really hard to get the truth. And then you fast forward 50, 60 years, or even 20 years, right? From when I was a kid till today, from when I was 10, 15 years old until I'm 29, 30, or 25 to 30. And there's too much information now. Now it's almost impossible to know what to sift through. And so when I'm reading this book, and I'm reading this book about, and a big thing that this author does, to his credit, and I want to give him a lot of credit because I really think that he deserves it, is he does an insane amount of homework. And he not only does he look into people's families and lineages, and I can't imagine how much homework that must take, he looks for significant dates in things, that someone died in Christmas one year, and then 5 years later, their boyfriend dies on Christmas. And you're like, oh, that's got to be weird. Or someone dies on Halloween, or commits a weird suicide on Halloween, and 20 years later on Halloween, someone else in their family also dies, and you're like, there has to be foul play. Or like, I mean, yeah, maybe, but I don't know. I mean, to me, you need to come up with more than just a date in common, I think, to really have a convincing case that that there's some kind of massive conspiracy. So, on one hand, I'm so impressed with the author's work for everything that he's done in terms of the research. On the other hand, I'm not impressed with the conclusions that he comes to. And I think that he might have gotten so lost in trying to do the homework and trying to find meaning in patterns that he just created a bunch of patterns. And I will say also, in his defense, that there's a lot of weird deaths, and death feels like it was incredibly common in the 60s and 70s. Musicians dropping dead, actors dropping dead, actors' families dropping dead. I mean, just some crazy, bizarre stories that are just constantly happening. And and it's weird. I'll really give him that, but I'm just not convinced that he has a story, that he has the actual narrative down pat. Nor am I convinced that he necessarily found the truth out. But I found that even though we live in a world that has so much content and so much information, I've found recently, at least, that people are, despite the fact that so much information is available, that people are willing to jump to conclusions and take the lazy path towards their opinions. And that's something that I really I really try to point out, and I don't want to say call out because I feel like call out is an obnoxious kind of way of putting it, but I try to make the point. And for example, I guess obviously this is news, and obviously this is relatively recent, but there was this whole big deal with Zelenskyy coming to the White House this past week, Friday. Today is Is today Monday or Tuesday? I think today is Monday. But it feels like Thursday. This whole week felt so long. I'm so tired. But Zelenskyy came to the White House on Friday, presumably to sign a minerals deal to talk about the ways that Ukraine could Ukraine that the war could end between Russia and Ukraine, and Trump and JD Vance really dug into Zelenskyy, and some things were fair, some things were less fair. When I initially watched it, I was like, "Whoa, this is awesome." And then I started thinking about it a little bit, and then I watched it back again, and then today I actually showed it to my students, and we are talking about it, and I felt far differently once I watched it and thought about it than my initial reaction was, or even like that initial. And again, I've talked about this a lot, and I'll keep on talking about it as long as it's a problem. But these stupid 2 minute or 3 minute clips on Twitter or Instagram that only capture a tiny percentage of the context is so freaking stupid. It drives me crazy. And so first of all, you have a language barrier. You have between Zelensky and Trump and JD Vance. And yeah, okay, he's a quote unquote Western leader, maybe. But the way that their philosophy and the way that the culture works, and even the way that their understanding of the language of language and their use of words are supremely different from one another. And one of the things that I think, for example, happened that actually caused the whole thing to spark up was when when JD Vance made a point about Zelensky, and he was being a little hostile, uh, certainly. Although I totally understand that patience runs thin when you give someone $350 billion or more, and then you're nowhere closer to coming to any kind of resolution or coming to any kind of peace treaty. You want to say, listen, obviously your system, we backed you up. Your system obviously isn't working. Now you got to work with us to see whether our system will work better for you and will achieve better results. And um, and so JD cuts him off and says, I think you're being disrespectful. And then Zelensky said something along the lines of, you know, um, you guys feel like you don't care, but one day you will feel. And then Trump cuts him off and says, "Don't tell us how we're going to feel. You don't know how we're going to feel. You can't tell us how we're going to feel, right?" And I don't think that that's what Zelensky meant. In all honesty, I mean, it's possible that he did mean it, but if I'm going to try to be a charitable human being and provide benefit of the doubt to anyone and give everyone an opportunity to really, make their case and make their opinions, make sense, and articulate them, he could be implying that if Russia continues the war and conquers Ukraine, that America will literally feel it next. Like, he's not saying how they're going to feel emotionally. He's going to say that the conflict might escalate to the point that America might actually feel the implications of the process personally with troops, and if with, God forbid, a war, God forbid, an elevated and escalated war. You don't want that. But that's not the way that it came across. And not only did it not come across that way, it actually led to the friction that ultimately blew up the meeting and went viral, and everyone freaked out. And the response, both in media but also with people that I talked to, was almost exclusively either all for Trump and JD saying exactly what they did, were all against Trump and JD for responding the way they did. There was no nuance. There was no middle ground. There was no one trying to understand where anyone was coming from. It was either, yeah, screw that guy. He's never going to win. He took all our money. He's a fraudster. He has no business being in power, which all those things might be true, and maybe they are, maybe they're not. I'm not even trying to comment, I'm not trying to talk about that. And then the other perspective is, oh my God, you're such a baby, Trump and JD. The guy's trying to talk and you keep on cutting him off and you're yelling at him and you're yelling over each other and you're just not stopping. And how is this going to how's this going to stop anything? You think that Putin's going to be impressed when he sees that this is the way that the agreements are going, the negotiations are going, and everyone's freaking out about everything. and and I'm like, wait, but like, that's how these things escalate. And this is actually kind of the reason, again, why I started this podcast to begin with. The reason I started this podcast to begin with was because I don't think anything in this world is as black and white as everyone makes it. And I think that the more that we understand that and the more that we can emphasize that, the better off we're going to be. For example, again, I typically, especially in these solo episodes, I have to bring up some kind of teaching metaphor, story, or example that happened recently, but today was one of those days where my students had an idea for a project that we were working on, and I initially said no out of hand. Don't ask me why I said no. Don't ask me what I was thinking. I just said no. Oh, right. The project was that we're working on a film we're working on writing a script for a film, and then after you write the screenplay, then we write the script. And while I was listening to Rogan's episode a little bit with, oh my God, I can't believe I'm forgetting his name. Oh man. Let me see if I could keep on recording without stopping. I think I am recording. Bill Murray. Thank you. With Bill Murray. And Bill Murray was talking about how they would basically, when there were a bunch of movies that he used to do, that they would get a script and they would start shooting it, and then they would do rewrites like every day. And so because you write a script, but then you have actual actors come on the scene, and someone might say something differently, or someone may have a different presence, or someone has a different personality than what the screenwriter may have imagined, and so one of my students asked me, because we were working on this, and my rule for the project was you have to finish a script before you can record. You have to do the hard work before you can do the fun work. And my student said, could we just record and then hand you in the script, and then after you grade the script, we'll watch the movie together? And I initially said no out of hand again, and then I had to force myself again, and I try to do this as often as possible. I had to force myself to stop and say, what is my problem? What do I care? And I'm thinking, what's the point of the assignment? The point of the assignment is to help these kids learn how to write realistic dialogue, to learn how to write thoughts out, to come up with a story, and to keep track of, okay, well, what's happening with this character development, what's happening with the story arc, how are we going to keep this in mind, how are we going to resolve this, what ends are open and what ends do we close up? And I was like, wait, but they can do that. And so I initially said, no, sorry, you can't do that. And then I changed my mind and I said, yeah, absolutely. I think that's actually a great idea. And I just don't, I wish and I pray and I really, really, really sincerely and authentically hope that people do this, that people start doing this more often. That when they hear something that wasn't an initial thought of theirs or idea of their own, that they don't just, even if you do initially just dismiss it out of hand, that you don't stay dismissing it out of hand, that you stop and you think about it and you think about wait, why do I care? Why does this bother me? It bothers me because I didn't think of it. It bothers me because it's wrong. It bothers me because it's threatening to me, but it may not be threatening to them. What about this is driving me crazy? And if you can go ahead and kind of get that resolved and you can understand why you're saying no. Sometimes the answer stays no, but a lot more often than not, the answer is some kind of middle ground, or some kind of negotiation, or some kind of, some kind of weird point where you say, well, it may not work for me, but I think it might work for you, so why don't you go ahead and try that? And I think that is where I'm going to leave everyone, because It is 10:40. I have several hours of more things to do, and I have to get up early tomorrow. And I am going to be back. I actually have no idea what the podcast schedule is for this week in terms of guests. I've been doing a lot of reaching out, a lot of working, and because of that, I've been more focusing on making plans with people rather than and introducing myself rather than having immediate podcast guests. So I might do another solo episode or two this week. I hope that I get a couple of guests, but as always, I'm going to put in my best and the most work I could do, and give you the best content and give myself the best content that we could hope for. Bye, everyone. Good night.